Muslimish, Assalamu alaikum. My name is Ali Rizvi. Thank you for the introduction, Wissam. And today we're talking about one of my favorite topics. It's Islam and science. This is the main reason when I was raised in a Shia Muslim family. One of my biggest interests was in science. I eventually went to graduate school for biochemistry. I became a physician. I earned my residency in pathology, did a fellowship in cancer pathology. So I've been in science for decades now. And I was always interested in it since I was a child. And I was always taught that Islam is very pro-science, that Islam is the religion that actually supports. I mean, science supports it, science validates Islam. And there's no doubt about this. And this was very interesting to me. That's why I started reading about it. Things didn't turn out the way that I thought they would. And ultimately, I rejected religion. I didn't reject religion for a lot of the other reasons people do. People do it for issues of justice, issues of politics, oppression. There are all kinds of reasons, and they're all justified. These are not. I mean, these are people who are my friends. I've heard some incredible stories of people who've had to reject religion, not just Islam, but other religions as well. But for me, the rejection of Islam and all religion came through science, because of science. And here's the thing, we've talked about a lot of the details. We've talked about verses in the Quran. We've talked about claims, scientific claims versus religious claims. Science answers the how questions, religion apparently answers the why questions. So there are all these different arguments. I've addressed them all in my book, but I want to just zoom out a little bit and just talk about the one basic thing that all religions have in common, and that is the idea, the very concept of faith. And for me, when I think of Islam and the narrative, everything we see in the media, we hear Islam is associated with terrorism, it's associated with subjugation of women, human rights abuses, all of these other things that you see. But I think that for me, the most problematic and sinister aspect of the Islamic religion is what it shares with all of the other religions. And that is the concept of faith, the idea that we should believe things without evidence. And I know there's been some discussion about that today in some panels, and there were great discussions, so I'm really happy that I came here. I know I came a little bit late, but whatever I heard, I think gave me a lot to think about and to respond to. So let's start with that. And so the first thing I want to do is I want to talk about how science and faith, they're about religion, science and religious faith differ. And to me, there are three different ways. Right? So science and faith, they have the same goal. They want to arrive at truth. What is real? What is true? But how do they do it? What is the process? Science, as I said, relies on evidence. So no matter how elegant or how beautiful your idea is, your speculation is, science will discard it. It will just throw it in the garbage mercilessly if it's not backed up by nature, and it cannot be validated with experiment. So it has to stand up to the scrutiny of experiment. Now, on the other hand, faith, by definition, what does faith mean? It means to believe in the absence of evidence. And this is something, people ask sometimes, well, there's blind faith, but then there's also reasonable faith. There's a difference between the two. There's no difference between the two. All faith, all religious faith, all sort of faith in claims that you can't prove, it's all blind faith because there is no evidence. Is this a dais or a podium? What's the word for it? Oh, whatever it is. This thing I'm standing at, we know it exists because we can see it. We don't have faith that this exists. We don't have faith that these speakers exist. We know they exist. We know them because we can observe them. There is evidence, clear, observable evidence that they exist. You don't have faith that the chairs that you're sitting on exist. You know that they do. You can physically demonstrate their existence. But if you have faith in something, that quite literally means to believe unquestioningly often and even revere rumors or hearsay, in a sense, that what somebody said a long time ago, what was written in a book, thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago, is the truth, truth by way of revelation. And this, to me personally, is a problem. This is something that I can't reconcile with the way that I think. So that is the first way that they differ. Second, scientific inquiry. When you ask a scientific question, when you investigate a scientific claim, right, you start with the assumption that you could be wrong. So falsifiability is the ability of a proposition to be proven false. This is a fundamental component of the scientific method. So what is the scientific method? It begins with a hypothesis, right? A hypothesis is an educated guess. You follow the hypothesis, you test it via experiment. The experiment either verifies or nullifies it, right, based on the evidence, or you may not reach a conclusion. Now, what happens with faith? Faith begins with a conclusion. You don't come to the conclusion, you begin with the conclusion. So, people say, okay, you have, you're allowed to question, you have elements of faith, sure, you can question it, you can doubt it. You can doubt it, and you can look for evidence for it, but ultimately there is a conclusion there. You can say it's not there, but it's there. Examples of these conclusions that we start with, these preconceptions: Jesus is the Son of God. That is your belief. Muhammad is Allah's messenger. Right? The Quran is the word of Allah. So once you believe these things, then you can go ahead and investigate them, but you usually never question that, Quran is the word of Allah or Muhammad is his messenger. Eventually, you go backwards from the conclusion, you pick out the evidence that supports your conclusion, and then you arrive at the same conclusion. It's very circular. So this is something that I saw a lot in practice when I was growing up. I had some of my best teachers, and I still have good relationships with them, most inspiring teachers, were religious people. My physics teacher was also my Islamic studies teacher when I was growing up in Pakistan. So we always used to have these discussions, and he still, to this day, had a great impact on me just because he made me think. He knows the conclusion I reached, and he's very comfortable with it. He disagrees, but he does. And this is the one thing that we were always at loggerheads about. So the third point, the difference between science and faith, is science is not only open to innovation or modification or evolution of its ideas, but it thrives on them. That's what the heart of science is. And here's one place where I want to quote Penn Jillette. If you're familiar with Penn Jillette, he is a magician, and he's also a famed skeptic and an atheist activist. And he has pointed out that in the past, you had the agricultural revolution, you had the industrial revolution, you had all of these religions and power systems, but the scientific revolution was unique in that it was driven by three simple words: I don't know. That was it. I don't know. You started with that. You started with a hypothesis. I want to investigate it. I don't know what the answer is. I'm going to find out. I'm going to go question it. I may experiment and I may look at it for years and years and years, but I may still not reach a conclusion. And then I don't have to make up any answers. I can just say, I don't know, and the work will continue. That is something that no previous revolution, no previous power system, no religion, no political power system had ever said before. So this is another thing, that science thrives on innovation. It thrives actually in a way on ignorance and openness. We had a discussion here, and the panel that you were on, sir, it was about, we talked about how science can be misused, and people use consensus as authority, and that a lot of that is true. There are a lot of problems in science. There are reproducibility problems. But how do you fix those problems in science? With science. Right? What do you do if you have a problem with okay, this study, I don't know if this study is accurate, it's not really working out in practice. You go and you do reproducibility studies. Other people do the same study in different places under different circumstances, and they come up with their conclusions. And with eventually the food pyramid and those examples that were given, eventually those views evolve. Nobody is called a heretic, right, for it. Yes, there is social pressure. Yes, there are people who write and they complained about Einstein's photoelectric effect, but nobody called for him to be hanged. At least the scientific community didn't. The Catholic Church may have persecuted Galileo, but his fellow scientists, they didn't. You may have opinions, but you're not going to persecute or actually harm somebody just because they think differently. The debate is always vibrant, it can be heated, but it doesn't result in the kind of, it doesn't produce the same kind of results that religious conflicts, for example, show. So, yes, innovation and modification and evolution are at the heart of the scientific method. But faith, and particularly Abrahamic faith, including Islam, is fundamentally characterized by infallibility of the prophet, divinity of the scripture, immutability of the holy text. God himself protects the scripture. Historically, those people who have challenged, right, these ideas, these precepts, what have they been called? They've been called heretics, they've been called blasphemers, they've been called apostates, and what has happened to them? They've paid in horrific ways for their digressions throughout history. Right? So, again, can't stress this enough, critical scrutiny and skepticism are at the very heart of what drives science forward, and it has worked. Now, the language of scientific inquiry is conservative. Conservative not in the political sense, thankfully, but it's conservative in the sense that it is cautious and it is humble. So evolution, we've talked a lot about evolution, heard a lot about evolution today. Evolution is a fact that is now verified not only by the evidence of paleontologists, but also by really strong, robust molecular genetic evidence. When people have looked at DNA, they've looked at the molecular elements in cells and the nuclei and in the genome, and it has been verified. But what do we call it? Do we call it the fact of evolution? We don't. We still call it a theory. It's still termed a theory. And this is where the humility of science comes in. It acknowledges that there could be more. Right? So this is very confusing to a lot of people who are naive about science, about the terminology of science. Well, if it's proven and if it's a fact, why is it still called a theory? If it's proven, shouldn't it be called a law, like the laws of motion? And it's true, there are laws of motion. So let's talk about this and let's explain this. Now, so what is a law in science? In science, a law is just the description of a phenomenon. So Newton's law of gravity, what is it? It describes the attraction between two objects. So you have the law of gravity, and this is exactly what it is. It says that the force of attraction between two bodies is directly proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. That is the law of gravitation. So, and the reason it's a law is because you can use it. It describes what gravity is. You can calculate the gravitational force between two objects. Like, for example, if you drop a bowling ball on the earth, you can actually calculate the gravitational force between them using this law. But the theory of gravity, what is the theory of gravity? That doesn't just describe what gravity is. It describes how or why this attraction occurs. So the only way that a scientific hypothesis can gain the status of a theory is after it has been rigorously tested, after lots of experiments have been done, and it's been demonstrated over and over and over to be correct, still termed a theory. So theories in science are works in progress. This doesn't mean that they're not true. It just means that they're added to and they evolve and they're modified as more and more evidence is discovered, and they grow. So For instance, going back to the theory of evolution, after Darwin first proposed it in 1859, and he proposed it based on the evidence at that time, was evidence from biogeography, from his travels. It was evidence from comparative anatomy, from physiology, from embryology, and several other areas. But over the next 150 years, there were more pieces of evidence that came in. The fossil record, for instance, right? Carbon dating fossil record. And then later on, DNA sequencing technology. So even though evolution still had a tremendous amount of evidence for it, it was strengthened over time with the advent of the discovery of the fossil record and the analysis of the fossil record, and then ultimately by molecular biology and molecular genetics. And today we know this. We've discovered new things. With DNA sequencing, for instance, we found a lot more about it. We found, hold on, just a second. We found that the relationships, the evolutionary relationships among living species shows that we're very, very closely related to each other when it comes to our genomes. They've also confirmed that beyond a doubt, and this is actually true, that all living things arose from a single common ancestor that lived about 4 billion years ago. We know that now, but it's still called a theory. The theory of gravity, similar kind of trajectory. Newton's theory of gravity that provided, and the laws of motion, provided us calculations that helped us eventually get to the moon. But they weren't completely correct. Eventually, at that time people knew about Einstein and his theory of relativity, but Einstein's theory of general relativity is the theory of gravity that we use today. Right? So it evolved over time, still called a theory. Now faith with claims of absolute truth, right? It doesn't have the kind of humility. It doesn't use words like theory, could be wrong, let's see what we can add to it. No, you're gonna add something to it, and you're gonna get executed. Or you're gonna get thrown in jail, even today, unfortunately. So faith has claims of absolute truth and immutable texts, and it has deemed them historically unquestionable on so many occasions. So it doesn't work. You can't, people say, you can't pray a rocket into space, right? It's by Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist, and he's also an atheist activist and writer. He said, if you base medicine on science, you cure people. If you base the design of planes on science, they fly. If you base the design of rockets on science, they reach the moon. And these are not things that you can do with religious claims. Now, yes, so can you do this kind of thing with prayer? Not really. Even the most religious people I know, right, would easily choose medicine over prayer if they were told to pick one. If you told them you have to choose, your kid is choking on something, or you're having a heart attack, or somebody has a cancer and they need therapy for it, what do you do? What are you going to choose? You can go with exclusively prayer and religious, you can go with religious revelations that you believe are true, or you can go with medicine and science. Even the most religious people will, I shouldn't say 100%, because thanks to Majid's presentation about what percentage of people believe all kinds of ludicrous things. Chocolate milk from brown cows. Well, I mean, there are people who believe that, so I'm not going to make to say 100%, but yes, most people, even the most religious ones, will choose science over prayer and over faith every time. And even religious people, they value evidence-based belief. They value it for everything except for their faith. And it's strange. I mean, George Carlin, this quote was attributed to George Carlin. I don't think he actually said it, but it's a great quote. And he said, "Tell people there's an invisible man in the sky who created the universe, and the vast majority will believe you. Tell them the paint is wet, and they have to touch it to be sure." And that pretty much summarizes it. So many people, they'll mock each other, they'll mock others. They'll say, evolution, where's the evidence? Climate change, show me the evidence. What all these scientific claims you're making, what is the evidence for the Big Bang Theory? Right? But When it comes to believing in angels, virgins giving birth, winged horses carrying, prophets to heaven, resurrections from the dead, they don't ask for evidence for that. They just say, this is my faith, it's unshakable. They never apply the same kind of scrutiny. Even they apply scientific scrutiny to scientific claims, but they don't apply the same kind of scrutiny to religious claims. And religious claims, by the way, many of them, virgin birth is a scientific claim. It's not a religious claim, and we'll get to that in a bit. So, they'll ask, well, can you disprove the existence of God or angels or winged horses? And of course, I can't disprove the existence of Zeus or Santa Claus either. None of us can. So, but that doesn't mean that those things are true or that they can be true. If it did, if the fact that you can't disprove things means that they must be real, then obviously there could be no end to what we all believe. So as I was growing up and I was coming across these ideas and I was thinking about them, I was beginning to see that God was kind of a lazy answer. My family believed in God. A lot of my extended relatives and the immediate relatives still believe in God. Many of my friends are Muslims. And we've always had these discussions. It's just not something that I found stimulating. I always found it a little bit lazy. And this is the whole idea of the God of the gaps. There are gaps in knowledge. For every scientific question that doesn't yet have an answer,